Hello, everyone. Welcome to this webinar. My name is Martin Parker. I'm a professor in the business school at Bristol University and particularly interested in alternative organizations and economy. How do we make a different world? It's my huge pleasure to introduce this event, which is going to be briefly introducing you to 4 books published by Bristol University Press and Policy Press. All around this general question of social change and how in an era of rising authoritarianism, we can have some hope in the possibility of pushbacks to authoritarianism and grassroots movements. So let me introduce our four panelists. First of all, Silke Roth, who is Professor of Sociology at the University of Southampton. She's co-author of Organising for Change, Social Change Makers and Social Change Organisations. Elke will be speaking first. Secondly, Christopher Gunter, Assistant Professor in the School of Social Innovation at St. Paul University, Canada, co-author of Social Innovation for Real World Transformation, How People Powered, no, I did the wrong one there, Roadmaps for Changing the World. And then third, John Page, co-author of Changemakers, Radical Strategies for Social Movement Organising, who serves on the committee of the Ella Baker School of Organising and has worked as an union organiser and in organising or campaigning roles at the Joe Cox Foundation, Equality Trust, Hope Not Hate, and the Runnymede Trust. And then finally, Peter Beresford, OBE, visiting professor at the University of East Anglia, co-chair of Shaping Our Lives, the National Disabled People's Organisation, and long-term lived experience of welfare benefits and mental health services. He's the author of Antidote, How People-Powered Movements Can Renew Politics, Policy and Practice. There'll be links to all of those books in the chat and at the end of this webinar. The event's hosted by Bristol University Press, who are publishing lots of really interesting stuff at the moment. Some housekeeping then. Can you please type any questions you have in the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, and I'll put them to the panelists towards the end of the session. You can upvote questions you're interested in too, so I'll see them more easily. If you've got any technical issues, could you use the chat? We've got someone in the background who can help you with those things. We've got closed captions enabled on the webinar, and there's a button at the bottom of the screen, CC Live Transcript. Please use this to show or hide text as you prefer. Attendees can order Bristol University Press books at a 50% discount. Use the code DSC50. I'm sure that'll be in the chat in a bit at checkout. And we're also offering a free ebook. Just add your name and address to the newsletter list via the form shared in the chat, and a copy will be sent to you. There will also be a recording of the webinar available after the event. Now, that's quite enough from me. Let's hear from our fascinating authors. We're going to start with Silke Roth, and in a sense, the way that I've engineered this is to move from the kind of the big stuff to the small stuff, in a sense, but that's a very simplistic account of 4 very interesting books. I just wanted to start, though, with the first paragraph from Christopher Gunter's book. He says, in recent years, it's become dangerously banal to point out that the world is in crisis. The environmental crisis, humanitarian crises, loss of trust in institutions, deepening social inequalities, economic precarity, and the rise of the extreme right are all symptoms of a world in trouble. Even more disturbingly, part of the problem appears to lie in a hardened belief that there is no alternative, that we're speeding towards collapse, that we cannot fundamentally change the course of things, nor act collectively to influence the march of history. All 4 of these books are pushing back against that pessimism. So can we start then with Silke Roth, who's written a wonderful book which historically demonstrates that we can push back against pessimism. So, Silke.
Okay, thank you very, very much, Martin. And I'm absolutely delighted to be here and talk about our book, co-authored with Claire Saunders, who sadly cannot join us today, and highlight a few points in a few short minutes. So I wanted to start with answering the question that the webinar title raises. can social movements still transform the world in an age of rising authoritarianism? And my answer is yes. And the thing is that I think it's very important, and that is what Claire and I are doing in this book, to define and reflect on terms. So first of all, we need to keep in mind that not all social movements are progressive. Some are conservative and contribute to rising authoritarianism. So in this way, we always think about social movements as counter movements. There is push for progressive change, for more democracy, and then there is pushback. So there is not, we don't see ever a solution that now we have democracy and all is well. There will be forces which will defend privileges, and then one needs to push back again. So, so that means we also need to think about what do we mean when we speak about rising authoritarianism. Do we conflate this with the far right, or are there varieties of authoritarianism that we have to consider? And so, however we define authoritarianism, that we have democracy in the first place has already been an outcome of social movements. We can go some centuries back. We can think about the French Revolution, the Haitian Revolution, the fight for women's right to vote. They all have been fought for. And that also means that when we think about democracies, we have to check our privilege. So not everybody has equal political or civil rights. So people are positioned very differently, and that also means that protesting while black might be much more dangerous than protesting while white, or as a citizen versus a non-citizen. So we always have to reflect on positionalities and privileges and take an intersectional perspective. So how to mobilize in an age of rising authoritarianism locally? There is so much talk about what is going on in cyberspace, and that is very important. But in order to push back the shift to the right, which has been enforced also by new technologies, it's important to strengthen local ties at the workplace, unions, and so on. But that also means that these local organizations, these social change organizations, this is the term that Claire and I use because we want to bring together thinking about non-governmental organizations, voluntary organizations, and social movement organizations that usually are studied separately, and see who is included, who is given voice, who is being silenced, to make sure that these organizations are truly inclusive and that people can speak for themselves, especially marginalized people. And what does that also mean for the pushback? It means being aware when restrictions are taking place and also avoiding self-censorship. I think that is extremely important in the current moment when there is marginalizing and silencing of voices that are speaking up in solidarity with Palestine. And the last point that I want to make in this short intervention is that it is important that, especially in repressive contexts, solidarity is important, is crucial. And social change organizations and social change makers might be active in a variety of forms that might not be overtly in a demonstration. It could be behind closed doors. It could be subversive work. So Claire and I, we very much appreciate Robin van der Voort's notion of subversive humanitarianism, which is service provision, but at the same time educates people about inequalities and mobilizes them to do something about it. And so subversive aid, mutual aid, and service delivery are just as important as advocacy and protest. And we are, in our book, we are broadening the look at social change organizations, social change makers, by looking at these different tactics. I hope that was enough, or not too much, for 5 minutes.
That was extraordinarily precise. Thank you very much indeed. That was wonderful, Silke. I mean, one of the things that you definitely pull out in your book is this idea that the slow, patient building of infrastructures, which often aren't as visible as the kind of the shouting demonstration, is a really important, and you document this, I think, is a really important way of thinking about social change, kind of almost in the background, almost in a kind of way that isn't nearly as visible as lots of the ways in which we might imagine change.
Can I add one thing?
Yeah,
Yeah, which is really important. So the thing is, like, in the book, we start out with historical variable context and describe that in different contexts, repressive or regimes or democracies, there are different forms of mobilization that are possible. And then at the end of the book, we come back to the outcomes, so that it is really a cycle that we show how these contexts are made by social change makers. And so that means that in contrast, what we highlight is a historical perspective, and that is not only on the macro level, but also on the meso level, because organizations change tactics over time in order to respond to the environment, or because they have learned something, or because there is a turnover of membership. And
yeah,
the historical perspective, of course, also concerns the individuals, because the life histories are trajectories into and through change making.
yeah,
And in my work, and Claire has found the same, people, on the one hand, they do not necessarily refer to themselves as activists or identify with one particular movement, but move between causes depending on what matters in a specific moment.
yeah,
And so the
yeah.
historical dimension is crucial whenever at whatever level we look. And so I
Yeah, no, it's really important, and I think that kind of historical perspective is one thing that your book really provides, and does give us reasons to be cheerful. Christopher Gunter, so you could talk a little bit about your book and the way in which you also provide us with a set of reasons to be a little more optimistic about pushbacks to authoritarian populism.
Thank you, Martin. That's kind of you. So yes, my name is Chris Gunter, and in brief, it's a handbook. And I need to state this very clearly that 11 authors, including myself, put a lot of their different expertise and specialization and experiences in this book, and that ranges from Julie Chateauvert, Philippe Dufort, Jonathan de Ronfolco, Chris Mackey, Anaïs Moraes, Houdon, Philippe Nomé-Nimbré, Julie Paquette, Jamel Sambouli, Simon Trompe-L'Épée, and our Amanda Wilson. So together, we are all members of the School of Social Innovation, past and former. And this was the idea in mind, as you said. It's a handbook, it's a critique, a challenge to social innovation concept, and looking towards different alternatives. It's based largely on personalized accounts and expertise. And it draws on this in each different chapter. And as you look through, there's 13 chapters that build towards, as you mentioned, understanding current circumstances, whether that may be current or contradictory meanings, understandings of the world, building towards new normative frameworks, or even just drawing on historical conditions and understanding some of the past victories, some of the past struggles, where we're moving forward. In a sense, it provides a really strong foundation of understanding these structures of oppression by offering, again, that little element of hope through emancipatory frameworks. So this, in one chapter, chapter 5, it's very much inspired by critical race theory or decolonialization or intersectionality theories, just to shed light on different possibilities of dismantling a system. I myself worked hard on the chapter on culture as resistance. That's my specialty. And looking at culture beyond the traditional ways as a tool of empowerment of marginalized peoples and groups at different levels, a way to transfer ideas between institutions and highlight maybe more equitable and democratic arrangements. Again, drawing from the past stories and narratives and putting forward normative judgments and iterations that might be prefigurative towards what we would like to see in the future. So yeah, as you mentioned, these are building towards different elements: economy, social economy. There's a strong chapter on cooperatives. Again, a different way of doing business. What can we learn from the social solidarity economy as alternate frameworks to still, if we would like a softer exit from the neoliberal and capitalist structure, what can that look like, right? So it's presenting essentially a good case for what exists, what we can aspire to, and where the work, at least up until more recently, has been working towards. And again, it gives a flavor for everyone. The textbook was objectively made with the goal to inspire and help younger people and people in the careers right now looking for solutions towards what might be a deeper transformation in those different fields. So again, organizational decision making towards different models of economic transformation. And in short, that's pretty much what our book's trying to do. Give a little bit of a flavor and provide a nice introduction, but also maybe a deeper hope and understanding of where we can go.
And a very wonderful book it is too. It feels like it's stuffed full of practical stuff, rather like the next book we'll be discussing in a moment. But Chris, before we go to the next author, just talk a little bit about this term social innovation, because innovation is very often a term that's used, by businesses and by business schools to talk about some fairly conventional capitalist forms of change. You mean to use this term rather differently?
Absolutely. So, in fact, the school itself was made as an objective to combat and as an alternative to that expression. While we see a lot of those institutions and organizations exist around us who use it, maybe more in the social entrepreneurial way, we've taken a much stronger emancipatory framework towards social innovation as maybe inspired by a lot of elements of social justice, and again that dismantling of different frameworks. So, looking at innovation that might help on the most basic level, I guess, inspire and change the world on a more positive level for society versus how can we recoup benefits after the fact to help offset something, or how can we manage society in a different way. So it's very much a counter approach towards what has been classically deemed as social innovation. And I think you bring up a really good point on the notion of it being classically and traditionally used this way. We generally get that level of discourse when people come to us and say, "Oh, social innovation, very social entrepreneurial. How can we help our business?" And it's always an interesting discussion to show alternative views and meanings of what that concept can mean.
Yeah, that's right. No, that's fantastic. And in some sense, there's a whole bunch of commonsensical concepts being re-articulated in all four of these books. You have to start where people are to some extent, don't you? So kind of turning questions of social justice, whatever it might be, in more radical ways, I think is the collective project here. John, can I move to John Page, co-author of Changemakers? Your book's pretty practical too, John, in terms of your attempt to be an useful resource for people who are interested in progressive social change. Could you talk a little bit about the sources that you use and your aims?
Okay, yeah. I mean, we're both very fortunate, myself and Jane Hoggett, the other author, in that we've spent more than 40 years is what you might call an activist participation. And so what we try and do in the book is we look at a whole range of theories about how social change happens. And then we try and look at our own experiences in various campaigns, from anti-blood sports through to trade unionism, anti-racism, etc., and give examples of how these theories could be interpreted from there. I think one thing I'd like to say is Martin Luther King once said, the arc of history is long, but it bends towards justice. And I think at the end of our book, one of the things we say is when we were growing up 40 years ago, we assumed that society was going to become fairer. All we had to do, but when we put our shoulder to the wheel to advance that, we were just speeding up the process of society moving to a fairer place. I think what we've seen over the last 40 years is actually the ability of the forces that Silke was referring to actually rolling us back. And I think we're at a crisis point internationally at the moment. One of the reasons I believe that is because I don't think democracy is compatible with the levels of inequality that we're seeing today. So in the UK, for example, we've got 4.3 million children living in poverty. The majority of them are in families where at least one person works. And so for those people who want to maintain inequality, somehow they need to persuade the rest of us that we shouldn't be coming together to advance inequality, but instead should be blaming one minority or another. And I think that's the key around your question. How do we effect social change in a period such as this? We have to recognise the dynamic of those people who have access to vast resources seeking to divide us. And so it comes back to me, I think, very much to a question of power. One of the things we look at is what we call a theory of change. And we say, if you asked most social justice movements, what's your theory of change? Very few of them would say, the people making these decisions are simply unaware of the consequences. And if we just convince them that what they're doing is having unintended, unpleasant consequences, they would change. Very, very few people believe that, but many people behave in that way. So you have really worthy people producing excellent reports, for example, on racism, about the disadvantage faced by racialized minority communities, as if the government is sat there unaware of those disadvantages. So the question then becomes, well, and this comes back to Martin Luther King. He once described power as the ability to make a decision maker say yes when they would rather say no. And for social justice movements, we really have to generate the power so that decision makers feel obliged to say yes when they would rather say no. And so to the key question about where we are today, it is about recognizing that there is this crisis. There were over 4 million people voted Reform UK in the last general election. If there was one held tomorrow, it would probably be twice that number. And we have to start thinking, why are our people believing that their best hope is a charlatan who's, blaming people crossing the channel in small boats for a crisis in our cost of living crisis, in our housing crisis, our NHS crisis, and so on. I'll pause there and see if you got anything more you'd like to ask me.
No, that is really useful. I mean, there's the theory of change thing is a really important caution to a whole bunch of change makers, I think, in terms of this idea that we need to kind of work out what the strategies and the power of those who are opposing us might be. And in your book, you work through that quite carefully, don't you? You're effectively using a set of theorists, many of them from the basically struggles about equal rights in the USA, to describe a kind of jiu-jitsu, sort of using the strength of the largely white and state-backed opposition in order to advance black people's interests.
I think so. I think the other thing that's very interesting, this comes from Jane McAlevey, is the distinction between mobilizing and organizing. I think one of the things we often in social justice movements do is we'll put out a call on social media and we'll get 1,000 likes and God knows how many people retweet or repost a video, our campaign video, and we think, oh, we're doing really well. But effectively, we can just be talking to people who already agree with us. And that really isn't making change. And so in this current moment, one of the things we're doing at the Ella Baker School, we're working with people to say, look, if we want to change the course of history, because if we don't have effective interventions in the next 4 years, our government will look very much like the current government in the United States. If we want to change the course of history, we're going to have a lot of conversations with people who don't currently agree with us. And that comes back to this concept of mobilize, gathering a force of people who agree with you is one thing, but actually changing the majority view within a structure, whether that's a workplace, a community, etc., it is a fundamentally different and more powerful thing to do.
Yeah, no, beautifully expressed, and that's a real challenge, I think, for the Green left, for those who want to represent progressive politics. Thanks, John. Let me just move on to our final author now, Peter Beresford. So, Peter, one of the kind of, if you like, one of the themes that I'm trying to pull out of your book is this idea about the connections between the personal and the political. So could you talk a little bit about your book and how you're trying to use your experience in order to think about the possibilities for social change?
Thanks, Martin. I'm afraid I'm the sort of person who has to write things down and then read them out. So there's a lack of spontaneity here, but I hope I'm following the agenda. And I've seen so many kind of connections with already what we've been hearing. And as I've discussed in the Antidote, which is out tomorrow, we've now had half a century of neoliberal ideology and politics here, dominating and damaging our lives and societies. Yet neoliberal is a word which many people we know aren't familiar with, although some of us do know that what it means is the unleashing of what we've been hearing about, the de-restricted dog-eat-dog market on a global scale, resulting in massively widening inequality, poverty, conflict, war, disease, and premature death. And as in the UK, we see different governments come and go, we also see neoliberalism staying in power. And the efforts of people from the global south to escape the worst excesses of that politics are then used to engender more conflict and hate as they are scapegoated as refugees, migrants, and escapees trying to do the best they can for their families, headlined as the enemy, danger, and existential threat to us by the people that we've just been hearing about. We've now reached the terrifying point where out-of-control populist demagogues rule the politics of two of the world's biggest powers, and as in Orwell's 1984, seem to be joining together sometimes to conspire against the rest of us. So how do we escape this fearsome, maddening reality? And I do believe it really is maddening. Not, I think, by retreating to some post-war notion of the welfare state. For most people, the welfare states come to mean something very different, the viciousness of the modern DWP and the inadequacy and crummy quality of so-called social housing, nor will we escape by signing up to neoliberalism, as some governments seem to think, unless we are the rich and powerful it has always privileged. Mainstream big charities, the other source of understanding, sometimes meant to help, are more interested in taking our money. For those like me who watch daytime television, increasingly by running ethically bankrupt lotteries more than in supporting our rights and needs. I say no, we've got to challenge the populism of neoliberals who still manage to get away with selling a bill of goods that does no good and divides and damages the 99% to the extreme benefit of the richest and most powerful 1%. And how do we do this? And I think the answer is already out there. The biggest challenge to neoliberalism has been the groundbreaking visions of new social movements, their liberatory rethinking of our identities, roles, relations, rights and values, to inclusion, equality, diversity, empathy and understanding. It's all out there. No wonder the attack from Trump downwards, including the UK mainstream media, has been so determined and vitriolic. But too often, NSMs are still hierarchized as single-issue campaigns. The unifying logic of our intersectionality, common oppression, shared rights and needs, trumped by the divisive strategies and tactics of dominant politics and ideology. It's this we have to challenge, otherwise we will never truly be the 99% we are, that alone will trump the 1% dominating us. We will just stay loads of minorities, permanent minorities, fragmented. Efforts to divide us will continue to succeed. And I think the answer is obvious in one sense, united we stand, divided we fall. Of course, it's crucial to build alliances, and some NSMs have prioritized this. So we don't start from a blank page, but it's not enough just to talk about alliance building. If those alliances are to work, to last, to appeal, then they must be truly equal alliances based on equalizing roles and relationships, structures, goals, and values. That's something we've really got to make progress on. The words of the great black lesbian feminist Audre Lorde must resonate in our heads. We will not rebuild the master's house using the master's tools. They've been tools of alienation, control, inequality, and division. Ours must necessarily be those of personal and political liberation, with the accent on the personal. The one won't come without the other. New social movements, with their emphasis on both the personal and the political and reuniting the two, can, I think, be the opportunity and means to build the inclusive solidarity that has to be our priority if we and the planet are to have futures. That's it. Thank you.
No, that was brilliant. Thank you, Peter. And again, superb timing. Thanks to all of you. Peter, can I just, before I move to some more general questions, to kind of pull some threads together? It's very powerfully towards the end of your book, you're kind of talking about neoliberalism living rent free in our heads, yeah, and that's being a particular challenge in terms of producing communities, collectives, orientations to social change. Could you talk just a little bit more about that? How do we stop ourselves from being our own policemen?
Well, the thing I think is interesting is the jewel in the crown, really, of the neoliberals is the way they even make us hate the people that they corrupt. So that they've got all sorts of dimensions of division and hate. And so nice, positive people like me, of course, end up feeling hatred towards the people who support Farage. It's very difficult not to. I've been in two towns recently, Beverley in the north, and somewhere in Hampshire, and I've seen exactly the same thing. I've seen actually quite comfortable towns, where they've made very sure that they've had their stalls out there and they're prioritizing them as markets, the much more comfortable people who might feel uncomfortable with what politics we have now. And I think that rather than all this talk about the red what's it, is what's actually going on. It's a much more subtle campaign we're experiencing from the far right, from the frightening fascist far right. I mean, I've got to say, I come from a background of family where my mother was a Jew in the East End before the war, and still resonates in my head when the fascists came and what she would say as a very ordinary, non-political person. And I can see that in the air, and it's frightening. So
Yeah.
it can't be more sophisticated than that, just to see this terrifying threat. And the only way we're going to change, we being the bigger we that we just heard about, that we've got to be less uncomfortable about talking with, is by talking to each other and challenging in a real way that division and that dishonesty that people are taking along.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks very much, Peter. That's really interesting. I just want to pitch one question at all of you. And you might come up with similar kinds of answers. I don't know. It'd be interesting to see what your pushbacks are. But it's a very common one in terms of thinking about social change, and particularly in the kind of current context where it seems that the forces arranged against us are very large in scale and extraordinarily powerful. So, Silke, and the question to all of you, but I'm going to start with Silke, is kind of, how do we get this small stuff to scale up? Yeah, so very often a whole bunch of people on the kind of grassroots green left are very interested in prefigurative forms of change and kind of, growing things from the ground. But then we're confronted by, Elon Musk, for example. So how do you persuade people that all this small stuff can add up to some big stuff?
Okay, so that's a great question. So I think the point is really that probably always multiple strategies are needed, and people have different tastes for tactics. So the point will be that some people will do things that other people will perceive as unpolitical or apolitical, but they will support refugees, for example, or provide I don't know, work in a soup kitchen and address austerity in that way. Other people might get active in local councils. Others might be active at the national or international level. And so I think the point is to respect, on the one hand, that there are multiple approaches, that some people are more confrontational and engaging in direct action, and other people are more comfortable with insider activism, and rather, which I think is something that unfortunately we see far too often, that within progressive spaces people police each other because people are not radical enough or not that enough or too much this, to have a tolerance and empathy for different ways of going about things, building coalitions and alliances that allow for these shades of being at the more radical flank or being making compromises, which of course always brings the risk of cooptation. And I really, really liked what John was saying about one has to speak with the people that one disagrees with, because that is the only way of making some change, especially in a situation like that, and listen to others. Yeah. And what I said earlier was that I was emphasizing the local level, and I did that because there has been so much attention to online organizing, which again is what John says is more mobilizing than organizing. I absolutely do not want to discount the internet, the online activities, but I think there is the risk that one is shouting at others and supporting oneself rather than coming into a thoughtful debate where one listens to positions that one doesn't agree with. And the last thing that I want to say is that as important as the grassroots are, I think, and even if there is a lot of criticism of the European Union, structures like the European Union can also be extremely important, I think, especially right now in the context of what is going on in the United States. And I believe that the whole thing about the tariffs is about breaking up the European Union, and that would just allow the tech bros to assume more rights. So I think that it's really important to acknowledge these different levels, how they intersect, and to communicate, have uncomfortable conversations. So.
Yeah, no, that's really nicely expressed. Chris, can you sort of approach this question of scale? Yeah, because it's a very common one, right?
Yeah, you're right. Most of my cultural case studies and our book in particular highlight a lot of the grassroots mobilization and their prefigurative attempts. And at least from what I've gathered, a lot of it does play on the ability for people to differently, but able to reinforce and institutionalize cultural values and norms that align with these abilities, these emancipatory or values of kindness, of wanting to change, of how we organize and view relationships versus how maybe a business might do so, right? And it seems, at least from the studies and the organizations that have been somewhat successful in doing this, they do it through reminding us of past victories, something that's increasingly erased, how our labor movements, for instance, won a lot of our different rights. This is not something that's showcased or circulated, but, they have been successful in the past in some sense. And a larger scale, if we look at some of those larger benefits, particularly in Canada, where it was a direct result of a postal union strike or a massive strike that took the entire country. And ultimately, we'd like to take hold of these opportunities and just institutionalize them further, reminding people in the next generations. But I think, like Silke said, there's this notion of these the ability to broadly spread out our prefigurative approaches. We don't all have the ability and capacity to do all. I take part in a lot of our social justice movements. I'm on boards of progressive, independent cultural and museums, but I'm certainly not always on the streets with my arms raised when I'm in a classroom teaching. So I think naturally, for me at least, while I see that these instances happen, I always worry actually at the larger barrier, which is the end goals of different people, right? How do we each individually, even let alone collectively, see our transformation, let alone get there? Like that's an important question, but it's hard to be convinced sometimes that we're all committed to the same transformation. I'm not so sure all the time that the dialogue we have, because we see these frictions and even the most progressive of organizations happen, right? As we're moving forward, and then suddenly, oh, the organization's gone. A conflict happened, and we just cited a slightly different view. So, this might be playing too much on the late Eric Olin Wright, but the idea of us seeing the same end goal is quite a challenge, let alone being able to have the capacity to move towards that together. But you're right. There's a lot of interlaying links here. Yeah.
Beautifully expressed. And if I can sort of riff on that to John, you know, you in your book have got a whole example of kind of case studies of particular sorts of issues, whether it's civil rights or anti-Hunt or gay liberation or whatever else. And these very often were movements that were aimed at quite particular goals. So the question about alliance building then becomes a bit trickier, doesn't it? It's easy to talk about the importance of kind of scaling up through alliances, but how do we actually do that?
Okay, well, I'll tell you how we don't do it, which is we try every couple of years. There's a new national organization set up that's going to be, you know, the campaign against austerity or one thing or another. And it starts with an alliance at the very top, and it has no grassroots. And every so often, you know, they'll end up calling a national demonstration. A few, or tens or hundreds of thousands of people will turn up, but it has no life because it's actually very much from the top down. One of the things we talk about in the book quite a lot, and we borrow from Hal Draper's Two Souls of Socialism, where we say, actually, do you have confidence in people, or do you think they need to be led by the nose? And we believe that if we're going to win, we are going to have confidence in people. People can find their own way if they're given the inspiration. In terms of the African American freedom struggle, which we take a lot of inspiration from.
Mm-hmm.
See, if you look at it, there's flashpoints when the impossible happens overnight. You know, the Montgomery bus boycott. Literally nobody travelled on the buses after the boycott was called. You know, literally hundreds of thousands of people were involved who hadn't been involved the day before. If you look at the SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee that organised the counter boycotts, they were like a wildfire spreading around America. Now, the really interesting thing is, what was the experience of people involved in those? And very often they were people who'd been schooled in organising in community organisations of one form or another. So particularly Southern Christian Leadership Committee, they were based very much on the work that'd been done throughout the 30s by the National Association for the Advancement of Coloured People. And so the networks existed upon which this new movement was built and took strength. If you look at the UK today, one of the things is almost all of our traditional networks have been ripped up. You know, on the big housing estates, there would be tenants committees. When I grew up, my father worked in a factory. It was a huge factory. The factory had its own sports centre that we were allowed to use because our dads worked there and one thing. There were all sorts of committees, and the way the Labour Party and the trade unions were interconnected in an incredible way meant that there were lots and lots of networks. Now, what's happened is most of those have gone. I mean, if you look at the Christian faith, for example, very, very few people attend church regularly anymore. Slightly different with the Muslim faith, but of course. The big workplaces have gone, the big unions have often gone, you know, the active union branches have gone. And so one of the things I was organising some years ago down in Thurrock, and I said to someone, oh, you know, we were organising against UKIP at the time. What on earth's going on here? You know, you don't seem to have many people out canvassing for your political party. And they said to me, you know, round here, if you started a darts club, no one would come. And I've always said to people ever since then, like, if you really want to transform your community, start a darts club, start a sports club, start anything that brings people together, because it's those human interactions that are the basis upon which everything else is built. And your answer, how do we convince people from the little things to scale up? The real answer is this: if you're involved in your community in an organising way that brings people together, that creates the pressure for a small change in your community, if you've built power, people feel it. And if people feel it, it transforms people from people who grumble and groan about what's happening to people who start looking for solutions. And the biggest problem we have at the moment is most people feel utterly disempowered. And when you're disempowered, you're happy to accept scapegoats rather than looking for solutions. Once you become organised, you're not interested in scapegoats. Who's got the power? How do we get them to make a different decision? What is the strategy we're going to adopt? You don't do that if you feel powerless.
Okay, all right. That's great. Thanks, John. That's really helpful. I'm going to start, Peter, I'm going to pull you in next, but I'm going to use one of the questions. We got lots of questions in the Q&A and a whole series of comments in the chat. One of the questions, the question I'm going to pull out for Peter, and I think you'll be able to connect this to what John's just said about, you know, starting a dance club, but also about this kind of question of how you kind of scale up, scale out, whatever it is. So this is from an anonymous attendee. How do you convince the large group of ordinary people supporting populists that they're being misled by the populists who belong to the 1%? It seems they very much feel that the populists will protect them. Any thoughts on that?
It's an impossible question to answer. Impossible to answer because it's so complicated and so many different things are going on. And I have to start from a different place. I have to say we've got to start thinking differently about what's big and what's small. The truth of the matter, it seems to me, is that historically, let alone where we are now, people are so alienated from what I would call formal politics. It's no wonder they treat them kind of like in the crudest way possible, because we are given such little equipment to deal even with traditional democracy, let alone the hullabaloo that's going on now, which is so difficult to make sense of. And we have to believe that because people seem to be believing the most crude and obvious, old-fashioned, unoriginal, disprovable lies being told by people like Farage that you could possibly imagine. But then the very same people are really adjusting to many other things in their ordinary lives. And, and it's also contradictory. So we have the media, the traditional media, vilifying people around issues of being trans or transing. And at the same time, people, more and more people are having to deal with issues around LGBTQIA in their personal life, because people are being people who they are as family members too. And this is true of the older people that we tend to see as being the proponents of all that reaction, who in their personal lives with their grandchildren, these are grandparents, these are great-grandparents who have got all the complexities around them being rehearsed in personal relations and roles, which they are accepting. That's why I believe we underestimate how much the populist right fears all that personal stuff. That's why it goes on and on about woke. And then you find out what woke really means, and then you hate that disgusting essential discrimination even more. So I don't think joining I'm a member of the BSA Motorbike Owners Club. You know,
I saw that on your bio.
I love it, and great, but I don't expect that's necessarily the route to political emancipation for me or everybody else. But I think that how we are with each other and having new conversations with people we might be afraid of, I think that's desperately important. That it's only for some of us, and we need to do it in ways that are kind and not arrogant, but to set up other conversations. The other point that's absolutely at the heart of the people I spoke to in writing that book is how many people are denied any consideration that they could even be part of modern politics. You know, people with learning difficulties, many disabled people, many survivors, every kind of, and when you add up those minorities, they make rather a large number of people in their own right in relation to barriers of communication, barriers of access, cultural differences, and the unresolved issues in relation to white privilege, which are well stated by a contributor to my book. We really need to get real with them as well. And so there's a lot of work for us wanting to do things in a better and different way to do as we're having ordinary conversations with people.
Yeah, thanks, Peter. It reminds me a bit in terms of the turn of this conversation of the changemaker Ivan Illich, who talks about this idea of tools of conviviality. You know, the conviviality itself, whether it's a BSA or a BSA owners or dance club, is one way in which we can encourage many ordinary conversations which might break down those kind of questions. And we've got so many questions, there's no way we're going to cover all of them. So I'm just going to pull a couple of things. This first one is for Silke from Heaven Medina. Could you give us a specific example or two of a covert, slow building of infrastructure that would happen behind closed doors? And that's, would this be like changing policies and laws?
Okay, that's a fantastic question, and I think it is also a very timely one when rights are being restricted. And when I saw your question in the chat, what immediately came to mind was the Jane Collective in the United States, which organized access to abortions when abortions were illegal, and so that meant that it was illegal. It was underground, so people had to trust each other with the referrals, and it was a provision of mutual aid. And so we could think about similar examples in terms of, and one of my PhD students is looking at a mutual aid in the context of trans communities, to what extent one is helping each other out in terms of advice and access to medical advice or services. And obviously, this is not mutually exclusive with trying to change legislation. So one part of the activity is then providing the service in the form of mutual aid, but at the same time also gathering information and then trying to influence policymakers to bring about legislative change. So that is the example I have.
That's great. Thank you very much. Oh God, there are so many questions coming in, and many of them are fascinating. Let me just try this one. No, I'll try Andrew Dolan asking John, what do you think are the major barriers to seeing the desired shift within social movements towards the types of organizing you outline in your book? So what are the barriers? That's the question.
Oh, inertia. I think what's it that the phrase, the iron rule of oligarchy.
Oligarchy, yeah.
And funders. Funders will love to fund something they funded last year on the basis they know that they completed the project and so on. Not interested in they're not particularly interested in what's new and innovative and risky. They're very interested in what we know these people, we're confident they'll be able to deliver, they'll be able to get the homework in on time. And often a vast amount of funds goes towards projects that are treading water and not effecting change. I think, Marshall Gantz talks about ceding control to gain power. And I think that's something that most people running, particularly national organizations, have very little understanding of. Actually, you build power through the activity of your supporters. If you are too controlling, if you say, we need you to turn up at 3 o'clock to do something, and that's the only thing you can do helpful, then you end up with very little power coming from the base, even though you have a lot of control over your movement. And it is very difficult, particularly in the trade union movement, for people in leadership positions to cede control. So they're no longer in control, but they are actually feeding the machine and keeping the machine well oiled. That creates the opportunities for people at the base to undertake meaningful actions. Can I just pick up on a question you asked Peter that he sidesteps, which is about how do you convince large numbers of people who are actually supporting far-right people? A few years ago, I used to work for an organization called Hope Not Hate, and one of our strategies was find out what it is that's actually really hurting people, and then organize around that, including with people whose views we don't like. Because once people start thinking about how you make change, they avoid the scapegoats. And in South Wales, we had an organizer down in Merthyr Tydfil, and she phoned me up and said, John, Merthyr Tydfil has the highest level of prescription antidepressant drugs in the country. There is a mental health crisis here. I think it might be an issue we should organise around. So I said, yeah, let's do that. So she organised this public meeting. There was a few of our team went down to support, and UKIP had been gaining strong. And at their meeting, 3 UKIP activists turned up. So naturally they thought, oh, here we go. They've come to cause trouble. But they came up very meekly and said, we know we don't agree with you politically, but this issue is more important than politics. We have come to contribute to this meeting. If you can find the issues that are really hurting people and then talk about how we collectively find issues, people's support for the far right scapegoating disappears.
Yeah.
Thanks, John. That's really nice. I think I've got time for one more question. I'm going to throw this one at both Peter and Christopher. Jean-Eric Jourdain, who's been posting lots of questions, but it's drawing attention to social media, and I guess it's very easy to think of social media as a really baleful influence, both in terms of individualizing, but also in terms of the sort of memes that are very often sent. So Peter or Chris, whoever gets in first. Is social media in our life for us?
One of the things I came to realize in writing the book was that they've got their agenda, and we've also got our agenda, and people constantly are using things like X and other things, all these huge, unprecedentedly huge companies with their own very negative aspirations and goals and determinations. We're still using them, and I find myself using X still, and you're trying to take that bit of agency ground. So one of the examples I remember in a piece of work I did with Sarah Carr, from a group of people who set up a really good organization of disabled people, was that in the end they ran out of road because the social media did engender conflict and nastiness between people, which they couldn't find ways of resolving. There are problems, but could I also stress, my partner works as a welfare rights advisor for people aged 50 and over. So she's constantly trying to sort out people being denied welfare benefits who've got entitlement, going to appeal, and all the rest of it. Most of the people she works with don't have mobile phones. Most of them don't have computers. Most of them are using landlines, which are not very accessible. Most of them are not part of the world of E. And still in places like Norfolk, you're not blessed with the access you've got. So we don't live in a world which is equally virtual for everybody, and we've got to remember that. And it's another of the barriers that can get forgotten about, because some people, and it then works in very negative ways. And that's one of the reasons why I think people as disabled people service users increasingly are looking towards having events and activities which are both possible to carry out from a distance, remotely, but also bring us together. And it's about building on what we learned from the terribleness of COVID, not forgetting the lessons.
Yeah. Thanks, Peter. In the interest of fairness, I'm going to give Chris 30 seconds.
Sure. Just 1 minute. I can tell you that as a counterpoint, but also as a complementary point to the invitation of Peter, I think where we can look to social media as a refuge is in those smaller community groups that exist in Canada. And I think in the US, we have at least 2 to 3 different groups that are buy nothing, being neighborly. They're all about nonprofits or charities that say, if you need something in your specific geographic neighborhood, someone might be offering it for free. Someone might be able to offer a service for free. And it was a very interesting alternative exchange service based that emerges simply on these groups, because they know they can get the most amount of people, because becoming neighbors as we once were is not as common as it is. There's a large anxiety about getting to know all your neighbors who are constantly moving or changing. But these groups can be a bit of a salvage if you're looking to share and you're at the lower level of economic capacity. And so there's hope there. You have to find it, though.
Agreed. I think the term neighbour is a really interesting one that we need to radicalize in all sorts of ways. We've got to start. I haven't picked up half the questions that people have asked. Thanks ever so much to the audience for asking so much and being so engaged. We had 160 people here, and that's wonderful. Just to really recommend the 4 books that we've got the authors of here, Christopher Gunter, Peter Beresford, Silke Roth, and John Page. There'll be details doubtless in the chat about how you can get their books more cheaply, and also to sign up for a free book. Thanks ever so much for listening, and thanks to you 4 in particular for putting up with my stupid questions. Thanks ever so much. Bye-bye, everyone.